Okay, welcome Jonathan Rosenbaum. Welcome to meet a critic that was defined by Jean-Luc Godard as the Bazin of America. And I think it's just about just. So Jonathan is really, in the world scale, he's one of the most appreciated critics. Exceptional case, and I would like to trace something of your life history here, because how to become a critic. The youngsters want to know that. So I'll ask my first question, my usual first question. What was the first film you saw, Jonathan?
I can't be sure of that because I was seeing so many movies from an early age, because my family were film exhibitors in a small town in Alabama, but I'm sure it must have been a Disney film, because when my brothers and it was a Disney cartoon feature. It could have been Song of the South. It could have been possibly Dumbo. I don't know, one of those.
Yeah. Well, tell us something about the circumstance. You said that your family was related to film showing, so it's,
yes.
How was it?
Well, my grandfather was an exhibitor. I think he started out in Nebraska, and then he was in North Little Rock, Arkansas. Then he moved to Florence, Alabama, where he got involved, I think, from about 1920. And he got established. I mean, basically, he started in showing films, I think, in Nebraska around in the teens, actually. And so there was a small chain of cinemas, but as I was growing up, at the height of this was all in northwestern Alabama. There were 9 cinemas and then by the end there were maybe 5 left. But when they sold the cinemas in 1960, when I was still a teenager. But between the time I was able to go on my own, and there were 3 cinemas in the downtown area that I could walk from one to the other, and I saw practically everything. I didn't see as many of the films of Universal because those were shown by the competitors, and even though we had free passes, I didn't go to everything there, and I couldn't walk there. So I saw most of the films, I guess, of the 50s, except for only a few of the Universals.
Yeah. Well, can you describe the overall impression? It's almost an impossible question, but the overall impression when these films came and came and came. So.
Well, it was closer to being like at home when I went to the cinema than it was when I went home, in a sense. I knew the people who worked there, who would let me go in, and sometimes when the theater was closed, I would roam around inside. I could walk in at any point, which of course people forget this, but this is the way everybody went to films back for many decades, actually. That they wouldn't look at the paper and see what was playing. They wouldn't check the schedule. They would just go to the cinema, walk in at any moment, and then when they got to the same moment that they remembered, that's when they would leave. And I'm sure there were plenty of times I did that myself. And then 2 nights a week, when my father would, not actually 2 nights, it was actually 5 nights a week, my father would drive across the river to the other, 2 of the other theaters. There were actually, or rather 2 of the other towns. There were 4 towns that they had cinemas in, and there were 3 that were right next to each other. So he would drive from one to the next to pick up the final receipts from the theaters, and we would come along. So that when he would do that, when he would go to talk to the manager, I would go inside and watch little glimpses, sometimes of the same films I'd already seen, sometimes glimpses of films that had not yet come to my own town. And so I was seeing, bits of, basically walking into the theater was a very natural thing for me. It was a kind of, it wasn't going to a special place. It was almost like the special place was walking out of the theater almost.
Yeah. So your cinema life was quite a collage to start with.
Yes, and I think generally I was, choosing on my own what to see pretty much. There were a few things. I think I got upset by when I saw Freaks when I was 9 years old. My father specifically said that I shouldn't see it because it might upset me, but he was out of town, so of course I had to go. And I was very upset by it because I think I identified with the midget at that point. And so I was forbidden to see House of Wax and The Thing. I remember those were two things that I couldn't see because they thought I'd be too upset by them. But usually I could see everything else.
Yeah. Was there possibly ever European films?
Yes, I think the very first. Well, I can remember in, let's see, I think it was 1950 in a family trip to New York. I wanted very much to see Bicycle Thief when it was being described. And because my father told me what he heard about the plot, and I was very moved by it. But then the theaters, they charged so much money. It was like adult prices for kids and everything. And so we couldn't go, and I remember I cried because I couldn't go. But we went to Destination Moon instead, which was also playing in Times Square, and I enjoyed that. So that kind of placated me a bit.
Was there any one turning point in your viewer's life, that some film that you thought that, well, gee, this must be art or whatever, that it made such an impression?
I have a boring answer to that. It's Citizen Kane. When I went away to boarding school when I was about 17, when I saw that was probably the film. It did that more, which I saw after Alexander Nevsky, but it was Citizen Kane that really, I guess, sort of like overturned, you know. But I also was deeply affected when I was very young when I saw on a trip to New York City Lights also.
Yeah. What was your formative reading? What is
well, my father read to my brothers and me, and so I grew up very lazy about reading because I was read to, and quite a lot. Mark Twain, the Oz books, sometimes plays like by Tennessee Williams, science fiction, mysteries, all kinds of things. You know, it's like there was quite a bit. And in fact, I was confused about the nights my father worked and didn't work. There were 2 nights he didn't work for the theaters, and those nights he would read to my brothers and me. It was called Surprise Night because he would kind of bring some kind of candy to give us, which was the surprise, and then he would read to us. So I grew up, I mean, I knew I wanted to be a writer many years before I knew I was going to be a film critic or be involved with film. Except I thought when I was very young that I would probably go into the family business when I thought there would still be a business when I got out of school. But I knew from very early, from grammar school, that I wanted to be a writer.
Mm. Did you ever go to serious studies after the school? Did you university or anything like that?
Well, I didn't. There were practically no film courses being offered at universities. I was an English and American literature major. I did take one film course my freshman year at New York University, which is where I started, and I took a course from a guy named Haig Manoogian, who was the mentor of Martin Scorsese. And I took it in order to see a lot of films I wanted to see. I thought the first time I saw Birth of a Nation, The Last Laugh. And I remember being very upset then that he hadn't included Citizen Kane, and I asked him why, and he said, well, people who don't know much about film think that Citizen Kane is very cinematic, but in fact, if you know more about filmmaking, you realize that it's actually not, because it's all derived from other media. This was like, not surprisingly, the standard line on Citizen Kane at this time. If you go to Arthur Knight's The Liveliest Art, and if you go to Paul Roth's The Film to Now, they say the same thing, actually. So as a protest, I asked if I could write my term paper in defense of Citizen Kane. And little bits and pieces of that wound up in one of the first pieces I ever published in a film magazine, which was my kind of attack on Pauline Kael's Raising Cain. I used little bits of my paper in that, actually.
Well, it's very nice here that Citizen Kane initiated so much in your life, because you certainly have these lifeline films or lifeline persons whom you are kind of defending from decade to decade, and we come back to Wells certainly later. Well, when did you write for the first time about film, and how did it happen? That who had the
Well, I think
wisdom to ask you to do that?
Well, I think there was something I did on my own initiative when I was still. I write about it actually in my first book, which is autobiographical, which was, I mean, it's a piece I don't even have anymore, but it was a piece that was defending an Elvis Presley movie, Follow That Dream, in relation to why that was a better film than Sweet Bird of Youth, actually, which came out around the same time.
Well, you defended Elvis.
Yes.
That's very
Follow
great.
That Dream.
I fully appreciate that, yes.
I wrote for the college newspaper, and in fact, I guess probably the first series, which I put on my website actually, of a serious long review of a film, was Dr. Strangelove. That I wrote for by then I had transferred to Bard College, 2 hours up the Hudson River from New York City. And so I'd written about that. By that time, I think my favorite film was no longer Citizen Kane, but Sunrise, which I discovered when I was still at New York City and went to a screening at Columbia University of that.
What kind of publication was that that you wrote about Strangelove?
It was just a college newspaper called the Bard Observer that came out occasionally at the...
How did things then proceed? When did you write for the first time, let's say professionally?
Well, what happened was, it was a very kind of torturous route to that happening, because what happened was, I wound up in graduate school. It was partly draft dodging, it was partly because I thought I was going to become a teacher of English or American literature, which by then was what my father was doing, because the theaters had been sold and he became a professor of English and American literature. And but I was very disenchanted with the way it was taught, and I really wanted to get out. And as soon as I found out that I was not going to be drafted, I decided to leave. And around this time, someone I knew from college offered me a job of editing an anthology of film criticism. And I was already a film buff. I had run a film society at Bard College and so on. But in order to really get involved, I started meeting all these critics. I remember, calling up Manny Farber on the phone, although I didn't meet him face to face. I met Andrew Saras. When I made a trip to Europe, I met people like Penelope Houston at Sight and Sound, and Peter Wallen, and so on. I think I met Bernard Eisenschitz around this time in Paris, and so I edited a whole anthology, and it twice made itself into galleys, but for various complicated reasons that are very boring, it never came out. But by the time I finished doing the book, I was very much involved in that world in terms of what I was reading. I had already written one piece, which I'm glad to say never got published, which was about Murnau, which was not a very good piece. But when I decided to move to Paris in 1969, the fall of 1969, after I'd been there for a little bit, when I moved, I thought the book was going to come out with the anthology, but it didn't. But then I started asking at Film Comment if they needed a Paris correspondent, and they said, write something for us, and if we like it, we'll run it. And so I started to write every issue for Film Comment, a Paris journal. A little bit afterwards, I started submitting things to Sight and Sound. The first thing I ever wrote for Sight and Sound was a review of Godard's collected criticism, actually. And then I started writing on a regular basis. And I was living in Paris on money I inherited from my grandfather's movie theater business, actually. And that money ran out by around the mid-1973, 74, and so I was scrambling and having a difficulty finding work. Actually, Pierre Cottrell helped me a great deal finding jobs then. He was quite wonderful in finding me all sorts of jobs, translating scripts, doing things of that kind. I remember working for William Klein, for example, in Paris. I was able to get some interesting jobs, but not enough to support myself. But I was offered the job, actually, of assistant editor of Monthly Film Bulletin in London. And it was a very complicated thing because they had to convince the government that I could do the job and nobody else could, which of course wasn't the case. But they hired a lawyer and actually got me the job, which I'm happy to say. And so I moved to London in the summer of 1974. And at that point, I was more, let's say officially a professional because I was working on the staff of Sight and Sound. And and also as assistant editor of Monthly Film Bulletin under Richard Coombs.
At what point was your association with Jacques Tati? Because I'm asking,
Oh.
I'm glad to ask because Jacques Tati will tomorrow be the hero of our final.
Yes, what had happened was I had been playtime. By this time, it was no longer Sunrise, but began playtime, I think. And my mother discovered, I think, reading in a paper in Alabama, that Tati's assistant was from Alabama, a woman named Marie-France Segler. And so she managed to get me in touch with her, and I thought, well, that's great, I could maybe have an interview with Tati in Paris. So through her, I think I arranged it, and went in to interview him, and for film comment, and it was, I sort of hit it off very nicely with him. And then a couple of months later, I got a call from Marie-France and said, would you like to come work for Tati? And I didn't even understand what he wanted me to do for him, but I certainly needed the work then, and I was very in awe of the fact that he was asking me to, and I was being paid a salary. And I think what he was is being his audience. I mean, his way of trying out ideas was getting up and performing them, and while talking about what he wanted to do for gags. And so I was just basically his audience. And I did that every day for maybe, I don't know, a week, 10 days, something like that. And then he became a little bit ill, and it sort of like was suspended, but it was an extraordinary experience of doing that. And, so yeah, I would say I had several cinephilic high points in Paris. One was getting to meet Wells for lunch, which was quite unexpected too. When I published practically nothing, writing a letter to him and actually getting invited to lunch, to my amazement. And I had also the opportunity to be an extra in a Bresson film, Conway dans Level, just by chance going to the Cinematheque one night, and when I came out, somebody came up to me and said, would you like to be an extra in a Bresson film? And I also got to watch a bit of Alain René shooting Stavisky, both in the studio and on locations in Paris. So there were some quite exciting things like that. But unfortunately, I couldn't make a living there once my inheritance ran out.
What did you do with William Klein?
I was translating a treatment or script of a film that it was just so Elliot Gould could be shown in English language copy of it. It was for a film that he didn't make, but he made a sort of an altered version called La Couple Témoin, which was then called Demain la Ville when I was translating it, which was a kind of a comedy. And so I met Klein then. It was nice, very nice working for him.
Well, we are now at the point of the start of your professional life as a film critic, so it would be nice to stop for a while and ask about your preferences and your kind of ideas about American film criticism at that moment. Let's take the great names that you mentioned already, Sarris, and you mentioned Danny Farber and so on. So, who were your gods at the time, if you had such?
I was very much influenced at that time also by Noel Birch, but mainly for reading in French, Riprese de Cinema, when I was in Paris. And I guess in some ways Roland Barthes influenced me, but not as a critic so much as, in terms of writing, I suppose. Farber was a very strong influence, and Sarris in a different way because of, in a way, even though I had seen all these American films while I was growing up, I basically learned American cinema from living in Paris and re-seeing them and seeing them in a different way. I mean, I didn't really start understanding much about Hitchcock or Hawks or Nicholas Ray, or certainly I didn't know who Nicholas Ray was or Samuel Fuller and people like this, except through French criticism. So that was really my route into becoming a critic as much as anything. Actually going to the Cinematheque, and I think it's very important to think of Langlois as someone who is as much a critical force as any of the critics, both on the directors of the Nouvelle Vague and on me when I was going every day, because he had a way of putting together all these sort of like films that you wouldn't expect to see together just because they were playing side by side. And so there was this almost like kind of atmosphere. The way I've always liked to describe it is if, that you could have a conversation between Preminger and Mizoguchi, like sitting at the same table. And it seems to me that whole concept came from the programming of the Cinematheque in a certain way.
So you feel that's something that you have brought to your writing, that to have all these people in the same table?
Yes, I think, because I think the main base of the writing that I was doing more than anything else was this Paris journal I was writing, for Film Comment, which was, very much based around Francophilia. I wasn't only writing about French films, I was writing about, whatever I was seeing in Paris usually, sometimes about other things. I had total freedom, which was very gratifying too. To write about whatever I wanted, really.
Well, let's still take the American critics one by one. So, your kind of idea, why was Andrew Sarris important?
Andrew Sarris was important for opening the door to the American cinema as a field of study and of directors in particular. Showing that names that meant nothing to me. Because I got that original issue of Film Culture that had all of those, listings and so on. And like many other cinephiles, I was going through filmographies and underlining films when I saw them, and being able to see a lot of films together by certain directors and so on. So that was certainly, it was more that position than the actual writing. I think insofar as I might have been influenced by Sarris, it wasn't always good, because Sarris tended to write, his writing has a lot of alliteration in it, which is, I think, a thing that beginning reviewers tend to like a lot, but I think is a kind of not a good stylistic thing. I think it can become a kind of tick. So it was something to get over in certain ways. Whereas for someone like Farber, I think Farber has always been considered, as almost his positions about film is important. But for me, always, what was exciting about Farber was his writing. I think he's as great a writer in a way as Agee. At least in his criticism. And I love the fact that the actual act of writing was a kind of adventure. It was not about necessarily developing a single argument, but of almost sort of like following a certain exploration. And it was an exploration in terms of the writing, not just in terms of watching the film. And of course Agee had an effect too, but I think that Farber had a more lasting one, because I think also, and this was very important to me, that Farber was really almost the only critic that I knew of who considered film criticism an art form, and not simply pricing goods, which is what unfortunately most film criticism is for most people. I think one of the most things one could say on behalf of Farber that's very important is that you can't go to any of his reviews and excerpt from them for ads. It never happened. And in fact, he's the only major critic that this has never, that to my knowledge, he has never been taken, you could take a passage from a review of his and put it in an advertisement, because most of the time you can't even tell whether he likes the film or not. It's like, that's what's also kind of interesting, that it goes beyond simply endorsement or rejection. It's a much more complicated mingling with a film, I think, and in terms of what kinds of trains of thought are set off by the film.
Well, James Agee died already in 1955, so he didn't ever make it to the modern cinema or the new cinema. So, but we can imagine perhaps that he wouldn't have, it wouldn't have been to him as natural as it was to Faber, who was immediately understanding Godard very profoundly, and so that.
But I think in a way Agee was very close to the aesthetic of neorealism, and I think that he was very much, and that even the kind of experiences he had in film was one that it seems to me, if you look at something like In the Street and certain other things, that it had to do with a documentary quality, but also, yes, Farber was very welcoming, not only to that, but also, unlike almost any of his contemporaries or people who came later, like Montiel, he wrote about experimental film, which was not done by, anybody else, at least within what was considered, like mainstream forums. I mean, he was the first important critic to have written about Michael Snow, for example, Manny Farber, among other people. I mean, you know. And so there was, he also, yeah, I became, I think partly through a combination of things, including his collaborations with Patricia Patterson, he became much broader in what he was willing to accept as, you know, serious cinema. And associating him simply with, you know, tough guy, you know, low budget American films is not doing him justice, because I mean, you now, particularly now that his virtually complete criticism is, I mean, film criticism has been published, even though, you know, it's not, he certainly missed the boat. It seems to me he was actually more responsive to more that was good and important that was going on than A.G. was. I think A.G. missed a lot, actually. Even as good as a writer as he was, I think he was not, he couldn't always see important things that were, you know, in front of him. And I think, you know, Farber was a spot, I think you, in terms of, you know, sort of like pricing goods, Farber was not always, you know, that was not his strength. It was really his writing for me always.
Well, then about a critique that is often opposed to Andrew Sarris, and that is Pauline Kael.
Well, I started out as a big fan of Pauline Kael's, as a writer, as a polemicist for her early writings, even when I disagreed with them. I should also mention Durnyat, Raymond Durnyat, who was a very important influence on it.
Yes.
But I found more and more that Pauline Kael was an example of someone who became more and more interested in power, and for me became less and less interesting as she became interested in power. And I mean by this power over the critics, powers over the audience, and less interested in the kind of films I was interested in. I think even though she was very strong in writing about actors, I think, and she remained a good writer, but I don't think, for me, she was that her enduring power is as a writer, but not as a critic. I think much even less than Sarris or Farber. I don't think that at least what she was arguing for and against holds up for me. And again, it's just about what I can use. It's not even about agreeing always, because some of the critics I learn the most from are not critics I agree with, but critics I can use. And I find I can't use her in terms of understanding film. I don't feel that I learn more about film from reading Pauline Kael.
I still pick one name who is I think it's relatively unknown in Europe, but seems to have a metaphysical meaning in the States. That's Roger Ebert, who died recently.
Well, Roger,
where would you place him, and what is his?
Roger Ebert was a wonderful person. I don't think he was an important film critic for me. I think he was, as a writer, I preferred when he wrote about politics than when he wrote about film. I think he was, I mean, the fact that he appeared on television, and he was very, you know, he was very much a mainstream figure, and probably within that context, better than many. But I don't think he was a person who, you know, changed the people's critical taste in film, in the way that someone like Sarris did, or even Kael did, and even if she did it maybe in a negative way. I don't think that was his importance. I had an enormous, in fact, I think the whole behavior of Roger in the last part of his career, when he became very ill, was really heroic, and he was an extraordinary person. But I think he's not a person I've learned, like as with Kael, he's not a person I feel I've learned about cinema from. I think his lessons are about how to be a decent person and all kinds of different ways. And it came out, you know, that would come out in his writing, certainly. But I didn't learn about film from him, really.
Well, I think this is interesting, and we are now in England. So let's take the English critics. Whom did you appreciate at the moment when you came to Sight and Sound? Probably not that much the Sight and Sound critics.
Well, Tom Milne was someone I admired very much, and to this day, I think is very undervalued. I think unfortunately, because his work is not online, most people don't know who he is, but I think he was a very good critic. Durnyat was important to me for many years. Robin Wood also. I think those were, for me, the major figures. I was in a kind of difficult position during the latter part of my time in London, because I was kind of defending, polemically for different reasons, the people at Screen. Even though today I probably wouldn't make the same defense for them, because I felt that they were at least exploring new areas that I thought were important, and the point is that it was very difficult in a way to work for Sight and Sound, because Sight and Sound was considered by intellectuals in England the establishment, and so I was part of the enemy, and there was nothing but scorn for that magazine among the people, generally the people who worked at Movie Magazine, the people who worked at Screen, and so on. But partly because they had a benefit, which was that anybody who became a member of the BFI automatically got a subscription to Sight and Sound. So they had all kinds of resources at their disposal, even though the BFI was also giving grants to Screen and Movie and so on too. And so they were also being supported by state grants. They didn't have the same resources that Sight and Sound did. What I think people didn't understand or appreciate adequately was that maybe 2/3 of what was published in Sight and Sound would be things from people all over the world who just sent things in. It wasn't a closed shop the way that Film Comment is, for example. It was a thing that was very much open, and it was the first film magazine that I really had a very big impact on me, including pieces by the editor, Penelope Houston. I mean, I think the best piece that I've ever read in any language on Lester Marienbad is by Penelope Houston, for example. I think there was very good writing, but I think Sight and Sound was very different than the way it is today. It was a quarterly, not a monthly. It was not tied to consumerism the way that so much of film magazines are now. It would be tied to, reviews of current films to some extent, but it wasn't absolutely tied, it wasn't wedded to that. It didn't follow the formula in the same way that I think a monthly would probably have to, or at least the way that Sight and Sound does now. So I think it's unfortunate that for many years, I think that the Sight and Sound under Penelope Houston, though it had its ups and downs, was a very important magazine that hasn't gotten its due, I think to this day.
Well, as a point of information, the Screen was published by Educational Department of
That's
BFI.
right. So it also was published by the BFI, but that's right. They had two magazines, one called Screen Education, the other called Screen. And Screen was sort of like the more radical magazine that was very much influenced by French theory, by Lacan, by Althusser, by writers like Stephen Heath, Peter Wallen. And there was a lot of important things they did publish, for sure, but I think it's kind of sad in a way that that whole world has kind of become completely decimated. There's almost no traces left of it in terms of the people who were associated with the magazine going on and doing completely different things and not really staying with it as a kind of cause.
Was there a moment that the film theory was so fresh that it even in a way impressed you?
Well, I thought it was a challenge about it, and I was interested in the challenge, plus the fact that they picked certain auteurs that were not being recognized as much in Sight and Sound, such as Frank Tashlin, such as Jacques Tourneur, to some extent Raoul Walsh, although I was actually responsible for Sight and Sound reprinting a piece by Manny Farber in Sight and Sound on Raoul Walsh, one of his best pieces. But generally speaking, they were picking, and Fullert also, who was not someone really liked by Penelope Houston. So, the point is there was a kind of whole group of other auteurs who were important that were being recognized. And usually their main forum was the Edinburgh Film Festival, where they would have publications and things like conferences and so on. And so there was a tendency also for the mainstream press to just simply attack whatever they would be doing at Screen and those people. And that's why it seemed important to defend them to some extent. Although I was in a complicated position because I didn't agree with everything they did, but at the same time I thought they needed more of a hearing. So I was kind of in between Sight and Sound and Screen, and which made it kind of more and more difficult, which is one reason why eventually I moved back to the States when I got a job working for Manny Farber, in fact, or replacing him as a teacher for 1 or 2 semesters, actually, in San Diego.
Well, I'll finish this interrogation
Yeah.
about personality by one person, because I think he somehow reminds you, because he's so wide. I mean, that he has all the life there in his writing, and that's Raymond Dudnia, whom you already mentioned. So, would you say, try to define what was his?
Well, he was very
What was
much,
it?
as much as Manny Farber was, a kind of a maverick and an outsider. And in fact, I wrote about him before I even came to Europe, I think. Or no, I think it was after I came to Europe. It was one of the first things I wrote for Film Comment, was a kind of appreciation of Durnat. And I met him after that. And in fact, during the time I was in San Diego, we wound up being housemates. We shared, you know, so we became very good friends. I visited him whenever I would go to London. And I think one of the things that was important about Durnat is that he was never a pure cinephile. I mean, sometimes when I first proposed going out for a meal with him, he said, "Okay, if we talk about anything except for cinema." He was interested in everything, and for him, cinema was a tool for understanding the world in a way. And I think that separates him from a lot of cinephiles, even though he was a cinephile in his own way. But he was also very much in opposition to what was going on at the time at Screen. Had written a whole book, which he was never able to publish, actually, because that was very, you know, there is much involved in consumerism in the academic film world publishing as they are in, you know, the mainstream world. And so they didn't know the use value of something that would be, you know, just sort of like proving all those people at Screen wrong. Although I think in some cases he did do that, or maybe arguably did. I think he was certainly armed with a lot of knowledge and sophistication about it, but he didn't really have. He only had, his form was sporadic. I mean, and peculiar. Like there was a long time when he was writing mainly for a kind of a fan magazine called Films and Filming, which was not a serious magazine, except for what Ray Durnat was writing for practically every issue. And I think I'm very happy to say that there's a major collection of his unpublished pieces that's going to be coming out later this year in England, which has been put together by a real fan and scholar of Durnat's work named Henry Miller. And I've read it in manuscript, and it's quite an extraordinary book. I think he is, to me, the most neglected, and the greatest of all English critics, in my opinion. I think he's a really major, and but I think he was a kind of, I think it's taken a while for that to sink in, because I think he was not a real careerist. He taught all over the place in all kinds of different. It was wonderful to see that he actually went to your hometown, actually, and in fact I would love to know more about the circumstances of that.
I'll tell someday. Yeah. Well, how would you define yourself, Jonathan Rosenbaum, of that time? What did you achieve? What had you reached as a critic at the moment when you left England in the late 70s, was it? Yeah.
Gosh, I don't know. I've always thought of myself as a writer first and as a critic second. So for me, the writing has always been an important aspect of it.
What were your best articles or essays at that point?
I guess probably my best were essays I wrote on Jacques Rivette, Nicholas Ray.
There was even a book about Rivette, small book.
When I left London, one of the last things I did was edit a collection of his interviews and a few of his critical pieces, which Tom Milne translated, by the way, I was sharing a flat with at the time. Yes, I mean, also I wrote about Buñuel. I was also writing, I guess, sort of like, well, I wrote about Godard, also. I think a lot of what my film culture consisted of was what I learned from France, and more than anything else, and also from some of the great research tools at the BFI, which was certainly very important also. And you know, just because I think that was, even though it wasn't quite the same situation as Paris, in terms of films you could see, in terms of the resources, in terms of what they had at the research library at the BFI, it was quite extraordinary. And I had it at my fingertips. So part of the job I had at Monthly Film Bulletin was we had to get complete credits of every film, and so we would actually haul 35 millimeter reels of film for certain things. and look at them on Steenbeck's just in order to get the credits. And so that all of that experience of being right in the center of the film world in terms of press shows and everything was very important to me too, because I was really operating as a professional in London, whereas I was an amateur when I was in Paris.
Mm. Well, then what happened in the States then first?
10 years in the wilderness, basically.
Yeah.
10 years of struggling to make a living as a freelance writer. I mean, I didn't, my job on San Diego, unfortunately, didn't last as long as I wanted it to. It lasted very briefly. I was lucky enough to get a grant which allowed me to start my first book, which is still my most ambitious book in some ways, a book called Moving Places, A Life at the Movies, a kind of experimental autobiography. I eventually moved back to the East Coast. I lived in Hoboken for New York and Hoboken. I wrote for the Soho News, which was kind of a small imitation Village Voice, much smaller scale. And I reviewed both novels and fiction for them and films for about a year and a half. But then I lost that job, and then I went back to the West Coast to teach at Santa Barbara. And finally, what saved my life was this gentleman here, when he left the Chicago Reader and recommended me as a possible replacement. And in fact,
Dave Kerr.
Yes, Dave Kerr. Sorry,
who gave us the Alan Van retrospective, the hero of our festival.
Yes. And in fact, the offer originally came a year before I was able to accept it, because one of the things that got me very fed up with academia is I realized that knowing about film had absolutely nothing to do with how employable one was, that I didn't have the right degrees, and therefore I couldn't expect to get hired more than a quarter at a time, until finally, after years of struggle, I got a 1-year contract. And that was the same time I got the offer from applying for the Reader, and I said, well, can you offer me a 1-year contract? And they said no. So I said, I'm sorry, I have to take this because it's the only job security I can get, but if you're still looking a year from now, please come back to me. Well, sure enough, a year later they were still looking, and so I reapplied when I wasn't even going to get rehired at UC Santa Barbara. And I moved to Chicago, where I've lived ever since, and wrote for 20 years at the leading Chicago Reader, the leading alternative newspaper, when there was such a thing as an alternative newspaper in Chicago. And that's really what I think established me and gave me unlimited kind of freedom as a writer, which I think was a kind of freedom that was established by Dave when he was writing during 11 years, I guess, was it?
Not that long.
9? Yeah, a long time. But he was able to basically set in motion a kind of serious writing about film that you really weren't finding in other weeklies at all, I think, except, I mean, with some certain kinds of exceptions, but it seemed to me that Dave was doing something that was different from anybody else. And it set up a space which made all kinds of things possible for me.
Well, this certainly, I have read what Dave Kerr has written about the kind of writing space getting smaller and smaller and almost into nothingness. So what has happened in the States ever since? Because it sounds like a beautiful dream that you could do that kind of writing, because all over we know this is kind of touches all of us very, very sadly, that there is no film writing anymore because no space is given.
Well, I think there is, but it's not on paper. I think that's the important. I think there is a lot of
the papers. Why in hell did papers take that line that they?
I think I hate to say, it sounds very corny, but I think the only kind of solution is a very old-fashioned concept of capitalism, which is or you could say the Reagan idea, which is you take whatever is your market and you exhaust it. You don't build new markets. You exhaust old markets. I mean, the Reader was basically financed by advertising. And because it was financed by advertising, they theoretically could have, a lot of these papers could give a lot of these freedom, but I would say out of at least 17 of the 20 years I was at the Reader, I had unlimited length. And then when they started to change, I had other kinds of freedoms. I could write about a film weeks after it opened, as long as it was still playing in Chicago. there were a couple of times when I wrote about a film 6 months after it opened, but it was still playing in Chicago, so I wrote about it then. All of this changed before I left. And there's no logical reason why it could have. It seemed to me that the only chance of success that a paper like The Reader had was to do something that no other paper did, which it did do for many years. But then when they started getting worried, because the advertisers started, because of, you could get free advertising online and things like this, they decided they had to be like every other paper, which was, to me, disastrous, because, they fired all their political writers, they fired all their, it's like, and it was crazy because, like a symptom of what was wrong for me about The Reader was that they have a feature to this day called What the Reader is Reading, online. And everything that's listed on there is mainstream. It's like that they don't read anything that's not the mainstream. So the point is, why not read Time magazine? Why read the Chicago Reader? It seemed to me that it was a kind of suicide. But it was followed by all of them. And the same thing happened with the Village Voice. The same thing happened with all of them, without exception. And I think it's basically because, unfortunately, there is this kind of conformity about these things, and plus the idea of people not wanting to establish new markets and taking risks of doing things that, over long term might. See, what was lucky for me is that I was able to, over the long term, establish myself as a market, I guess, even though The Reader wasn't establishing itself. So, in fact, it was purely luck for me that when I was deciding I wanted to leave The Reader in about 5 years ago, the publisher of The Reader offered me the possibility of a website. At the time, I was very dubious about it. I didn't even know why I wanted to do such a thing. But I said, but it was kind of like, it was a little bit like Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. He didn't want to go to Hollywood, so he said, you have to give me a perfect offer before I'll accept it, like Final Cut and, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in my case, I said, I only want to have a website if I have total editorial control. And the editor of The Reader wanted to be able to edit my website. And I said, under those conditions, I'm not interested. So I won. And so everything I ever wrote for The Reader is on my website, and I have total editorial control. If I don't like the way I was edited 5 or 6, 10 years ago, I can go back and change the piece now and turn it to, the way I like it, and I can go back and make corrections, which I have to do. In fact, I've already had to make one correction on the DVD awards, and I think I may have to go back and do another, but that's something that's another great thing about it. And it's done wonderful things for me. I mean, The Reader did a lot of, for many years, great things for me, but my own website has been wonderful. So I don't think that there's a decimation of criticism. I think that there are online magazines that are doing things that no one was doing back in the golden age of cinema, in terms of, I don't think that there was any paper publication that was doing anything like Rouge, for example, in the 60s, or Lola Journal, which is co-edited by Adrian Martin and Gira Shampoo, for example, now. But I think the point is that instead of alternative journalism, we have something called niche markets. And I think niche markets have great possibilities, and including all different kinds of criticism. It's just that it seems to me that the internet is great if you're focused and know what you're looking for. If you don't, then it's of no use at all. But it seems to me that there are great potentialities that are there, and I've been a beneficiary of those possibilities, and some other people have too. But many others feel it's like the end of the world, who don't feel any benefit from it. But I do think that there are great potentials there, even though it's not the same as paper publications.
And plenty of brilliant young writers who are very knowledgeable. That's something that you wouldn't have expected 10 years ago.
Well, that's the thing that's very important, because I think that there's actually possible for people who are in their 20s now to know things about cinema that I couldn't possibly have known at that age. And I think that that's something one can't dismiss. It seems to me that, I think that part of the problem is, you used to be able to judge groups demographically by people in one country, one city, one place. Now it's quite different. It seems to me that there is a community, and a very important community, and a community that does all kinds of things that communities does, but it's not in one place. It's spread all over the world. It's restricted linguistically by being, having to be in one language or another. But I mean, incredible things have happened to me because of this community. I mean, just to give you one example among many, I write this column for a Canadian magazine, CinemaScope, about DVDs. And I remember writing once that there was a box set of de Oliveira's first 25 films, I think, or something like this, that was coming out in a huge box set. And I said, well, I can't really afford to buy this, but if you wanted to send me a review copy or something like this, I'd be happy to write about it. And then I get this email from somebody from on the other side of Illinois who said, I just bought this and I'd be happy to lend it to you. Just give me your address and I'll send it to you, keep it as long as you like, and then send it back to me. Sure enough, he did. And I sent it back after I used it and wrote about it. And this was a total stranger, I think that there's all kinds of, and in terms of accessing information, I like to give the mention that, for example, one thing that seemed to me there was a very big difference in film culture is that when the filmmaker who was a team with Jean-Marie Straub, Danielle Gouillet, when she died, there was, I think, again, thanks to Dave Kerr, there was a obituary in the New York Times. I think if she had died at any point in the previous decade, there never would have been an obituary in the New York Times. The point was everybody knew because of the internet that this happened right away. Whereas in the past, these things would, and it was things different in film culture. You would see a film by Bresson in the 60s, and then maybe a month later you would meet somebody else who'd seen it, and then maybe a year later you'd read about it. And now you see a film, and immediately there's a community that you can sort of converse with on the internet. So it's, the whole sense of time is different, the whole sense of community operates differently. So, and it can't be compared. It's not two versions of one thing, it's two different things. But I think it's very important to develop the potentialities that exist in this new culture, because I think it has possibilities, including things like DVDs that didn't exist before, even though there are not, of course, enormous losses and gaps, and these are the problems are not going to go away. But it does seem to me that you can communicate with other people now in a much better way than you could before. At least I find it in my own experience that that's true.
Well, let's take one example of something that has been a lifelong search for you to define Orson Welles. Certainly, Orson Welles is something that. Can you summarize what you have done with Welles along the years? All the jobs and kind of different. You even compiled one book of your own writings about
Yes.
Welles, and then you participated in the restoration of Touch of Evil somewhat.
Well, I think,
and then
yeah.
you were editing the Bogdanovich interview book and so. But tell in your own words, yes.
Well, I think probably a key part of the concept for me is the title of my collection of writings about Welles, which is called Discovering Orson Welles, which means that it's an ongoing process. People are always looking for closure with Welles. It's like that legendary, complete version of Magnificent Ambersons, which is supposed to be somewhere, and which will sort of like capitalism has happy ending. All we have to do is find the print. It's like. The funny thing is, when they think about, we can finally get a version of this film or that film that conforms with Welles' intentions, completely overlooking the fact that Welles' intentions would change several times a day, and there is no such thing as one version of a Welles film that he was sort of like, except for the ones that he finally finished and, went on to something else. But for the ones that were not finished or were taken away before they were finished, we can't talk about a perfect film somewhere that we can find. It's an ongoing process without closure. And the fact that it's without closure is a fairly radical idea, but I think he was a radical filmmaker. And we don't reject Kafka for that reason, after all, do we? He never finished a novel. He never, but we don't sort of like say, oh, he was like a total failure after, early successes of a few short stories. We accept that. It's just that when other people's money are involved, the whole morality changes, and suddenly Welles is somehow guilty of something because people who have too much money already didn't make still more money. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And this continues to the present, where we have a book of dialogues with him published by Henry Jaglom, which purports to be Wells having asked Henry Jaglom to do it, when anybody who was close to Wells knows that this is a lie, that Wells didn't know he was being recorded by Jaglom, and found out close to his death and broke off his friendship with Jaglom. And yet in the States now, if you go on the internet, you'll find that everybody believes this, because there's no, and that's the version people want. People are much happier with the sort of failed Wells than with the successful Wells who kept working. There's another book that came out that's much better, that has this has a lot of press. A book that has practically no press at all is a book of conversations with Wells with his mentor, Roger Hill, that he was, approved of their being recorded, and is a very beautiful book, and you can find it on Amazon, but most people don't know about it or are not going to get it. It's just called Orson Welles and Roger Hill. But it's typical that there's a kind of way in which that Wells is an ideological issue, and will always be an ideological issue, because people think that somehow what happened to Wells means that either he was wrong or the Hollywood system was wrong, when nothing is ever as simple as either of those possibilities. It's much too complicated, and no two projects are the same for why they didn't come to, if they didn't come to fruition, why they didn't. And so it's a question. It's a series of questions that remain with us, whether the films all going to get finished or not. And obviously, some of them probably won't in any form, which is too bad. But I think the point is that we always thought people always want to have him pegged. They want to sum him up, and it seems to me part of the genius of Wells was to make that impossible. Whenever we think we've got the last word, something else we discover, or something else is out there in the world that proves us wrong. And I think that once we accept that, we start to understand what was great about Wells.
Well, that was a beautiful ending. Our time is up. Thank you. It was brilliant. Thank you.